Hello and welcome to the Celtic Whiskey Pod with me, your host Al Higgins. We have finally recovered from an amazing Whiskey Live Dublin 2023 and I'm back today with a great conversation with one of the people I got to talk to over the weekend. Miles Munroe is Master Blender at Westward Whiskey in Portland, Oregon, and he visited Dublin to take part in Whiskey Live, where he also hosted one of the best masterclasses at the event. When most of us think about American whiskey, we think bourbon or maybe rye. But following on from the explosion of craft distilleries opening up, there's a less typical but very familiar style of whiskey emerging, single malt. When I started talking to Miles at Whiskey Live, I realised that I had in fact visited the distillery where Westward is made, albeit in a very early form back in the early 2000s. So inevitably I was curious to find out how the company has evolved over the years. Like many emerging whiskey distilleries at the time, they made unaged spirits such as gin to keep the cash flow rolling until the whiskey reached maturity. In the case of Westward and their parent company House Spirits, their particular gin had a unique progression from a niche brand to worldwide recognition. It is only recently that the company has shifted away from gin, and the reasons for this are covered in the conversation. You will find that Miles is one of the most enthusiastic distillers when it comes to flavour creation and discovering his own way of doing things. I really enjoyed our chat and it has opened my eyes to the possibilities and opportunities of distilling single malt in Oregon and indeed the rest of the USA. We of course sell Westward Whiskey at the Celtic Whiskey Shop and I will summarise their bottlings at the end of the podcast. Now, here's Miles.
You're listening to the Celtic Whiskey Pod, the home of unchill-filtered conversation.
A very warm welcome to Miles Munroe from Westward Whiskey. Miles, thanks so much for joining me today from New York, not from Portland. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit, why you're in New York in a minute. But we actually met a few weeks ago at Whiskey Live Dublin. So first of all, welcome to the Celtic Whiskey Pod. But maybe you can also tell me, how was Whiskey Live for you?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, good to be here. Whiskey Live was great. It's so yeah, we're a single malt made in the States, right? And yeah, we sell outside of the country quite a bit. And I'm the master blender, so I'll say that I'm a bit choosy about where I'm headed around the world to work a stand, and yeah. I always love Whiskey Live Dublin. I feel like it's a great mix. Some of those bigger whiskey shows, you can kind of feel a bit small with so many of the massive brands there, that Absolutely. Have a huge presence. And at Whiskey Live Dublin, I feel, yeah, there's a good range and actually quite a few smaller brands that I'd say you wouldn't normally find at a show that size. So I think it's really unique and pretty great for that.
Yeah, cool. And I assume the whiskies went down well. Obviously, I was there and I tried them. I loved them. But what was the kind of feedback? Because you're probably more used to talking to American consumers about whiskey. So in terms of the Irish perception on American single malt, especially, how do they go down?
It's interesting. Of course, in the States, we're known for making bourbon, and I think that's also just kind of, God, I don't know, so deeply understood in the culture there that is whiskey, right? And that, if you say whiskey in the States, people assume you mean bourbon. Anywhere else, whiskey means malt whiskey, right?
Yeah.
And bourbon is a kind of whiskey. So I've always found that bringing our ideas, our concepts, which I don't think are really that complex, but outside of the States, I think people really understand almost immediately what we're doing. We're making single malts. We're just making it in the States, and we're making it in a style that is reminiscent of American whiskey. We're using malted barley instead of corn. And so, yeah, I think, I did a masterclass at Whiskey Live Dublin as well. And yeah, I think the reception was really warm. I mean, I saw that we sold out of everything at the end of the show, which was amazing. Another great thing about that, Whiskey Live Dublin, you can buy right there, which I think is really a fantastic thing, is you're trying new whiskeys and being introduced to brands. So that was a great reception. Yeah.
Cool. And you're in New York now, so what's going on in New York? Is this a bar convention kind of thing?
It is, yeah. It's BCB. So the original is in Berlin, and
Yeah, yeah,
the Berlin. But I think this is an offshoot that they started doing a kind of branching off, and so
cool.
this is Bar Convent Brooklyn. So we're in Brooklyn, New York for the week. We've got the show tomorrow and Wednesday, and that just it's really trade focused, more like
Yeah,
kind of on premise, and so yeah, a lot of bartenders and people in that industry are here for the week, and so you've got a lot of brands and activations going on. And so, yeah, we've got a stand. We've got some amazing bartenders that will be making drinks with us at the stand. It's actually a group called Chocolate City's Best, based out of DC. We've worked with them in the past, and so we're going to have some pretty good fun making drinks with them, and just kind of rubbing elbows with the trade.
okay, yeah, whiskey cocktails a go. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
So, as a whiskey distillery and a producer of spirits, talk to us through the sort of journey of Westward Whiskey. And I believe the company started off as house spirits in Portland.
We did,
maybe. I actually visited there in what was probably the very early days. I think it was.
Oh, that's right.
2007 or 2008, and I don't think you were there. I met a guy called Matt Mount, and
yes,
there was a single pot still on top of a pile of bricks, couple of barrels, literally like half a dozen barrels, and some IBC containers full of exotic liquids. So, talk us through the evolution of house spirits and Westward, because there are some interesting twists and turns along the way.
Well, yeah, with any journey. That's right. You did. You went in very early days. The company was started in 2004, so it was still pretty young when you popped through in Portland there. And that's great. So you got to see the original distillery, the closet-sized distillery that it was back then. But so yes, I mean, so we were started as house spirits. The company is still actually house spirits distilling, which is Westward is the single malt brand that we have out in the world. But yeah, we were started in 2004 by two folks, Christian Krogstad and Lee Medoff, who were both working for a brewery here. Well, not here. I'm in New York. Back in Oregon, it's called McMinimans, which they've got this sort of really cool business concept where it's two brothers, the McMiniman brothers. They've been buying really old historic buildings that had either been completely forgotten about or were in a bit of a state of disrepair. They'll revive them and turn them into either a brew pub, an actual brewery, a hotel, something like that. And they've got like dozens around Oregon and Southern Washington now. It's a really, really cool thing.
Yeah.
And they were both working for the McMinimans. Christian was sort of head of brewery, sort of beer quality control, and Lee was just starting their distilling program. They were just kind of getting that off the ground. This was, I think, in the late 90s, and so Christian was making basically, this beer wash that he'd send over to Lee to do some distilling experiments with, and that's when they kind of came up with this concept of, look, we're brewers. We want to have this great beer influence on how we're approaching whiskey. There's really almost no one making single malt in the States, and that's where the idea for Westward was born, between these two people. The idea that we're also in the Pacific Northwest, and where we are there, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, what we call the Pacific Northwest of the country. This is where most of the high quality barley is grown. The bulk of barley that's meant for malting is grown in this area. So they just took that idea and ran with it and said, we can essentially create a whiskey that has a sense of place, that is very much a local product. It can speak of its origins, where it's coming from. So off they went, not not a ton of savings. It started off very, very small. Just the two of them. They actually piggybacked onto someone else's distilling license at first, but
Oh,
you have
wow.
to understand, back in 2004, major distilleries included, I think there were under 40 distilleries in the entire U.S.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about well over 2,000. I think we're at 2,200 and counting.
Wow. So it's
Yeah,
the same sort of exponential explosion that Ireland has seen. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And here, of course, we had prohibition, which obviously just devastated the industry. It took nearly 100 years to get back to where we were, because we're now, I think we're over now, but we're just very recently back to the number of distilleries we had before prohibition in the States.
Yeah.
So it took us nearly 100 years to get back on our feet. But so that's where it was started. Back in 2004. Next year we're going to hit 20 years, which for a craft distillery in the States is up there. Yeah. But formed with the idea of wanting to create a unique American whiskey, a single malt, using barley from our area, inspired by beer made by ex-brewers.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning of the journey.
Yeah, I love the Northwest and Portland in particular, because there's so much going on for the drinks consumer. Great beers being made and great spirits. And you didn't mention there, but when I visited, there were other things being made, and I suppose a big success story for the company initially was Aviation Gin, which was having, I suppose, the right product at the right time in the right place.
Yes,
and I don't know if you want to delve into that sort of story a little bit, and about what happened with Aviation, because some people might not know.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing, right? We are House Spirits Distilling, and then we bring the brands out to the world just as the name of the brand, right, rather than the name of the distillery. We also created Aviation Gin. I mean, early days, and I think you're seeing this a lot with smaller craft distilleries, is if you're going to make an aged product yourself, which we always have, we've never sourced whiskey. We've made it and then have to age it ourselves. So
yeah, of course.
There's years there where you have nothing to really sell, And so, House was definitely very experimental in the beginning, and one of those things was making a gin. The concept, I think, was first maybe seasonal gins, using botanicals that were in season or reminiscent of a season to make these different styles of gin. And out of that was born Aviation, which was what we call the new Western dry gin, something that was less juniper forward, that was more cocktail friendly, and was just balanced in the flavor of the gin. And as you said, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. Right time, right place. Aviation was created by Christian in 2006, along with a bartender in town named Ryan Bulgarian, and it just exploded.
Yeah, and of course it was sold off to Ryan Reynolds. Was it a complete sale, or do you own some sort of part of the brand name still?
So the gin just kept getting bigger and bigger, which was great. I often say that Westward is the whiskey that Aviation built. It allowed us to have revenue coming in, allowed us to make the whiskey the way we wanted, and wait the long amount of time that we wanted to do it properly. By 2015, we were building a new distillery, something that was bigger, that could really help us make a lot more whiskey. And it was towards the end of 2015 when Aviation just was getting so big that we didn't really want to. I think we felt that our time with Aviation was coming to an end. It just was such a massive brand, and this company that had been helping us sell it nationally before we took it internationally expressed interest in buying it, and that made sense for us because they'd been good partners for I think 3 years or 4 years before that. So we knew it was going to go to someone who understood the brand and understood how the gin needed to be presented. So we sold it completely to that company. We still made it. We actually still made aviation up until August of last year. We were just contract distilling it.
Wow.
So yeah, that was in 2016. And then I think maybe by 2017, that company got Ryan Reynolds involved. And so he bought in with them.
Right. Okay.
They partnered up. And then, of course, it went from big to massive. He was taking it everywhere with him, talk shows and photo shoots and anywhere he could bring the gin. And it just exploded. And then in 2020, Diageo bought aviation. So it's just, that's the little gin. Go. Good. It keeps writing more and more new chapters. It's pretty exciting. Yeah. Something that we're still really proud of, to see it get as big as it has. It's
kind of like a dream for anyone, in a way, when they set out with a small distillery, that a brand does, have that journey. And to see it ending up in Diageo is like a full stop on the journey of aviation. It's gone there, it's made it.
Where are you going to go from there? Right?
It's a bit like being in a band and writing a number one hit single, and then it's like, well, that's going to keep you on tour for the rest of your life. You can keep going.
Yes, love that. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a hit.
Yeah. So I gather you're a musician, are you? I'm a sort of retired musician at this stage, but maybe you could tell us a bit about your own personal journey, what got you into whiskey and distilling, and how you became the master blender at Westward.
For sure. Well, I've been with Westward about 10 and a half years now. And yes, I was a musician, definitely. I grew up around music. My dad was a rock and roll promoter and producer, and that was just sort of my childhood. I was around it all the time, so naturally just fell into playing music. And was a musician, was playing guitar in some bands and touring, and that's all fun and everything, but it doesn't pay you, right, until you write that hit, as it were, right? So I found myself in hospitality, in the service industry. I was in fine dining, and it was through that. I mean, I was front of the house, behind the bar, and that just kind of dropped me into the deep end of spirits and wine and beer. And I was just constantly asking questions. I was always bugging the sommelier about something, trying to visit distilleries. I was in the kitchen asking chefs questions about flavor all the time. It just really grabbed my attention. It just became a fascination, the idea of flavor and how it's created, and working in these restaurants that, one in particular comes to mind where, our baguettes were delivered by the old lady that baked them. She'd ride up on her bicycle, every couple of days and drop off the bread for the restaurant. And it just immersed me into that world of flavor and of makers, and eventually found myself managing a whiskey bar, and had this wall of great single malts, Irish whiskeys, small batch bourbons, and went from appreciating it to obsessing over it and going to tastings to, I think, eventually realizing that this was a calling.
What was the name of the bar?
It's an ancient steakhouse in Kansas City.
Right.
Called the Majestic, and at the top floor is a cigar club whiskey bar.
Cool.
And it's actually the building that the old political mob boss Pendergast used to own, and that's where he'd hold his meetings. And he was one of those guys. He owned a concrete company, and sometimes people disappeared and all of that.
Oh, right.
But it's a really cool place, and just had some outrageously good spirits there. And that's just, I just kind of had this epiphany because I was playing in a band at the same time that the drummer in our band was the buyer for a chain of bottle shops there. He was their beer buyer, and this was, I think, early aughts, so kind of just the mid explosion for craft beer here in the States. And so I'd bring her all this great wine and whiskey, and he'd bring all this great beer, and we'd sit and try through everything and taste and talk about it. This is where, for me, the connection was made. I was like, I bet craft beer makes really incredible single malt whiskey. So that kind of set me on my journey. So I went to brewing school. I went to the American Brewers Guild, which was started by some alumnus from Harriet Watt University in Edinburgh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I studied the science and engineering of beer, moved to Portland, which is, sort of the brewing mecca of the States, really.
Yeah.
My mother's from Portland as well. I'd been there a bunch, and everything just kind of came together. Moved to Portland, went to brewing school, and I was a professional brewer in Portland for a few years. But the idea was to get to making whiskey. I love beer, and the idea of using different grains and different styles of yeast to create all these great flavors. And I wanted to apply that knowledge to making single malt whiskey. So eventually I started hearing that, those guys that make aviation, they're actually making a lot of single malt whiskey right now. So tracked down Christian and made him hire me.
Great. And you mentioned the brewing for whiskey there, and it does talk in a bit of detail on your website about the importance of the brewing process. Maybe explain to our listeners what your philosophy is on that, in terms of flavor development and fermentation times and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. That reminds me, I think our big hit at Whiskey Live Dublin this year was the Stout Cask, which was not a huge surprise, but always great to see. Look, if I could sum Westward up in a sentence, we're brewers making whiskey. Our founders, myself, Andrew Tice, our director of operations, most of my distillers all come from brewing, because it's an important part of who we are, where we're coming from. The area that we are is known for brewing. And, the idea for us is, we're looking ahead. We love whiskey. We respect the traditions of whiskey. Obviously, that's why we do what we do. It's just, we're looking to the future, and we think there's more that can be done. And, for us, that's really exciting. Applying, when I say brewing techniques such as, even the grain we use, it's a high quality brewer's base malt. It's 2-row barley. That's most craft brewers would use as their base. It's a high color malt, so it's kilned a bit longer. We know that coming from brewing that you're going to get more of those caramelized, nutty, biscuity flavors if you have this kind of higher kiln base malt that you use. And so our maltster is in our area, only about 10 miles away. That they supply most of the malt for pretty much all the breweries in Oregon. Still rooted in beer there. But I think a big point of differentiation also is how we make our wash. We're using a pale ale yeast for fermentation. I think that's pretty unique. Our fermentation is a low temp, slow fermentation, 6 days, 5 to 6 days, 120 hours sometimes at about 22 degrees Celsius. This is
high ester sort of development.
Exactly. Exactly. A slow process. They're enclosed fermenters too. We're working with a very, very clean fermentation. So yes, high ester, very clean floral honey notes that we're getting. A lot of great stone fruit is produced as well. It's actually the Sierra Nevada Pale Ale yeast strain that we use.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, it's still an American whiskey and it's rooted in beer. And we know that, that Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, it's just an iconic, pale ale from the US. And so we want some flavors that are reminiscent of that. The idea being, right, like we're definitely making whiskey in a somewhat different way. And we want it to be different, but not so different that people just don't know what to make of it, right? You just don't want to alienate people with something that's so different that they just can't really wrap their heads around it. But so we want some reminiscent, flavors that people can associate with like American craft beer, such as that pale ale. And that creates just a really, really beautiful beer wash. We actually let people taste the beer wash when they tour the distillery.
Oh, cool.
I think not something you'd find most distillers doing. Probably not wanting people to try the wash as it's fermenting. But for us,
it's kind of done as a joke sometimes in Scotland. Certainly, if you go to Islay or somewhere like that, and you're on a VIP tour, they might bring out a glass and just get you to smell it, and it doesn't smell like something you want to drink. Especially they're really cloudy ones that are just ooh.
Well, yeah, and if you ferment fast and hot, it's going to produce something different. And
Yeah.
I think as a distiller, you have the stylistic choice to say where you want to focus your energies on, and in that way, Westward is deliberately inefficient. Using an ale yeast that might not produce as much alcohol as M1 or some kind of dry distiller's yeast, or if it does, it's going to produce some off flavors. And for us, we have this very, I guess I'd say, minimalist approach to how we distill. Our pot stills are very low reflux. We have very, very short toppers. Those swan necks on our stills are quite small. It's a short run, and so you're not getting too much refinement. And so that's how we want it. We want to preserve all these great grain and fermentation flavors, because that's where we put so much of our efforts. So that you can taste the raw materials. You can again get a sense of place.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, a lot of the effort goes into the very beginning stages of how we make the whiskey.
And in terms of, you're using a pale ale malt, essentially. Have you added any sort of experimental adjuncts or, things like crystal malt or anything like that along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially as rooted in, brewing as we are, I look at whiskey as 5 elements. To me, it's grain, it's water, it's yeast, oak, and thyme, right? Or I could say wood, maybe not specifically oak. And each one of those elements, there's myriad choices you can make on how those are going to express. So we're constantly experimenting with each of those. And we've done, a bit of, crystal malt. We've put in, a bit of chocolate malt, roasted barley as well. We do this really fun thing. We have, because our wash system is basically a 30-barrel, 3-vessel craft brewing system, right? Yeah. So we'll have brewers come to the distillery. We'll usually probably have some drinks and talk with them about what we think would make a good whiskey, but we'll actually clone one of their beer recipes. We'll recreate one of their beers, whether it's a stout, red ale. We just had a brewery come up from San Francisco. It was their Belgian wit, and we'll invite them to the distillery, and we'll make their beer with them. But then we double pot distill it and put it in casks and turn it into whiskey.
Obviously, you're not using hops, though, are you?
No hops. I think once or twice, just as a sort of formality, just a quick something in the boil. But so but we use the same yeast strain that they use.
That's cool.
True to their recipe as we can, but then turn it into whiskey. And so I mean, you're getting a few different elements of change there. Actually, we've got a club that we run through the distillery where we run the club ourselves. It's national now in the States. And our latest release, I release something each quarter, is what we call our 2 malts. So it's mostly malted barley, but I added about 12% malted rye that was grown in Central Oregon to the mash bill as well. Nice. We've done that with some malted wheat, some white winter wheat that was actually grown by the same farm in Central Oregon, a family-owned farm, where they malt on site. The family's really into beer, and they've got this an old piece of German equipment. It looks almost like a set of conveyors, and it mimics floor malting. So they're growing and malting right on the farm. It's really a cool thing. Yeah.
Cool. And we talked about the stout cask, which was it was probably my favorite I tried at Whiskey Live. I think I tried a cask strength that was lovely as well. And you're on the sort of doorstep of one of my favorite wine regions in the world, the Willamette Valley, which for anyone who likes Pinot Noir wine, it's an absolute mecca. And if for anyone listening, if you're into your red wine, and especially Pinot Noir, get to the Willamette Valley, because there's some incredible wine being made there, and we don't often see it in Ireland. You walk into an off-license and liquor store, you might find one bottle from Oregon if you're lucky.
Is that right?
It all stays in the States, I think, because it's all getting consumed within the States. A lot of producers don't have it's not necessary for them to export. So you've used Pinot Noir barrels to great success as well. Are you using them raw? Are you extra charring on or doing anything to them before the whiskey goes in?
Yeah. We're getting them, as you said. I mean, the wine region is really close. The AVA, it's about 45 minutes from my distillery. So we're getting these barrels fresh and just using them as is, what we would call a wet fill, right? This is straight from the winemaker, picked up, if not the day they're emptied, usually the day after, and going straight to the barrel house. The idea here, though, is it's more of a secondary maturation. Yeah, so we're putting usually a 4.5, 5-year whiskey in these freshly emptied Pinot casks for an additional, 10 to 12 months or so.
Yeah,
is the idea there. But yeah, it's a great region, and we're just Oregon. We're on the Ring of Fire. Yeah, that Western Ring of Fire, right? So we don't have too much in the way of volcanic activity, but there used to be, and so the soil is really, really great. It's a volcanic soil. It's really rich. It's great for we've got a fruit loop here as well. You can grow quite a bit really successfully here. And the cool thing about the wine region is it's actually at the same latitude or around the same latitude as Burgundy, France. Right?
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that because, you don't really look at a globe or a map that closely. And it always surprised me. And even some parts of Oregon wine country is even further south. I think, like Northern Rhone, even that sort of latitude. And it's surprising because you think of the Pacific Northwest as really far north, in terms of European sort of perspective. And it's not. It's actually, it's close to Mediterranean sort of in terms of latitude. Yeah. But different climate, obviously, as well,
Right. Well, that's the thing, too, right? So it is a valley. The Willamette Valley is between two pretty big mountain ranges. We have the coastal range to the west, which, that separates us from the Pacific Ocean. It's very close. So that has a huge influence on weather. And then, we have the Cascade Range to the east, which has, it's got, I think the 3 biggest peaks in Oregon are along the Cascade Range. And, Portland, and then just south of us in that wine AVA, we're at the bottom of this valley and kind of up into the foothills a little bit. So, it's an interesting, set of soil conditions and weather. You get this influence of the ocean from the west. But, when you get over the Cascade Mountains to the east, a lot of Oregon is high desert, really high altitude desert.
Yeah.
And so you get this really strong drying influence as well. It's this really interesting combination. And of course,
you can do all this within a couple of hours drive, 2 or 3 hours drive. I did it myself and went up the Columbia Gorge, and I was really surprised to find myself when I got towards the end, like in desert, I was like, what the hell? Drove a bit further, went up Mount Hood, and I was standing on a glacier, all within one day. So, it's a very varied geographic sort of typography, I suppose. Is that the right
Absolutely.
word? Maybe. Yeah. Still talking on grapes. Are there many people making brandy or grappa or anything like that?
There are a few, and right, because we have the great wine region, and then as you get into the Cascades, that's where our big fruit loop is, and people growing plums, pears, apples, and so there's a few brandy makers. Clear Creek is a great one. They're probably our bigger craft producer. They make an amazing pear brandy. They've got 12 to 15-year-old apple brandies that are outstanding too. They're really cool. Stone Barn Brandy Works is another one. They're in Portland. They're very small, and they're more of a niche producer. They're putting out some pretty great brandies, eau de vies, some great whiskeys. Using local grains as well. They're very small. I mean, you rarely find them outside of Oregon, but that's as you said about the winemakers as well, and I think that goes for the breweries too. There are obviously some very big breweries here in Oregon, but for the most part, like Portland has 80 something breweries in the metro area alone, right? And which is astounding.
Yeah.
But you're not going to find most of them outside of Oregon, just because they're so small. They've got a brew pub, they're just producing for their region, and sometimes even just their neighborhood.
Isn't that the way it should be, really? That's kind of the way historically it was.
That's how it was, right? Yeah, exactly. You've got your neighborhood brewery, and I think we're finding that the people are seeing more success that way too. As craft beer in the U.S. kind of plateaus, and we see what's working and where the oversaturation is, and that kind of staying local seems to be the move.
In terms of whiskey making in the States, obviously, bourbon is still the big thing. I can't think of many distilleries just doing single malts. Is there much of a movement towards American single malt as a category, as a standalone sort of style of whiskey? Yeah.
Look, as I said, when we started in 2004, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 other very small craft producers making single malt. Now there's well over 200 in the States. So, and most of those distilleries, they're making other spirits, right? They're making a rye or a bourbon or both as well. But there are a few of us that really, really focus almost solely on single malt, which is, that's the only whiskey we make. I think back in 2016, we got together with 8 other single malt makers. We formed the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. Cool. And the idea being that, we were starting to kind of see more and more people get involved in making single malt, and then also see that there really isn't a standard of identity, right? There's really no category that can kind of describe it, which, obviously if, you're an experimental craft producer, you don't want too many regulations, right? You don't want to stifle your creativity. But
that was going to be my next question, actually. What is there sort of governing what you can make in terms of single malt? Are there any restrictions?
What stands now? Not really. I think so. There's a term on the books, malt whiskey, right? Mm-hmm. And that's basically saying 51% or more of your mash bill, should be a malted barley.
So it's based on the bourbon definition with
right. It's very reminiscent.
The corn being taken place by
exactly. It's very reminiscent of that description, and but there's nothing that really categorizes single malt that has some standards of an identity. So that was really the purpose of us getting all together. I mean, one was to just support each other, and collaborate. And, we say that all ships rise with the tide in this movement. But also, to put together some kind of category. So the consumer could have an understanding of what is American single malt? Like what could that mean? Right. And then also a protection, not only a protection of the quality of the category, but also the producers themselves.
Absolutely.
If you look at, coming out of Prohibition, you had just a handful of big companies that pretty much had all the whiskey, right? And they became massive brands. And so they led legislation, they lobbied, they pretty much guided how whiskey was made and advertised and, legislated for most of the 20th century. And so we saw this as an opportunity to put down some regulations that could work for everyone, right? And could really be an inviting, to the category. So we put down some standards of identity, and through that's been, many years now, but the TTB, which is our sort of governing arm for spirits, they've reviewed everything. And last year they told us, this looks great. We really see no problem with it. They opened it up for public comment, and there's been just rousing support. So they said that it will be passed. It will be ratified. Now that could be this year. That could be next year. As far as, the machinations of government go, it's slow. So, but we do know that it's in the works to be passed. And so we have helped define a new category of whiskey for the States and put in place some protections for consumers, but mostly for the makers, so that smaller producers can get involved.
Yeah. It's kind of an evolution, isn't it? Of the sort of creation of categories and, dare say, regulations. We're seeing a bit of that in Ireland, where I don't know if you're aware of the whole single pot still designation ratification and changing that's going on. It's like going to what's the word used? But anyway, it's going to happen soon. But there's a sort of cooling off period type thing going on at the moment, where basically having to redefine what is our signature style of whiskey being made in Ireland, which is an interesting time. And it's because so many more producers are coming along and making whiskies that don't necessarily fit the bill of the classic.
Right. Yeah. What are some of those? What are some of those? I guess regulatory issues that are coming up for smaller producers.
Yeah, well, I mean, single pot still whiskey traditionally would have used a whole bunch of different grains, and it would have been mostly a mix of unmalted and malted barley, but then some rye grain and oats in the mix. And the current regulations only allow for 5% of those other grains, which is the sticking point, essentially. I'm kind of boiling it down into the sort of bullet points because it's a bit more complex than that. But I think having, people like Fiona O'Connor, who's done a huge amount of research into old mash bill recipes in Ireland, has basically said, look, this is fine. The current regulations are basically applied in terms of our sort of modern take on it. But, if we want to recreate traditional styles, we have to change it and increase those other grains. So I think it's looking like oats are going to become a big thing in Irish whiskey. It's very much watch the space and see what happens. But we could see a lot of distilleries having high oat contents in their whiskey, which would be sort of quite fascinating.
How incredible.
All these whiskies are currently maturing, so I think some of them are only just becoming whiskey. So a few more years, maybe 5 more years, and we'll get a better grip on what's going on.
Well, and I love that, as we're getting more people involved and, looking to the past, that we're seeing that some of these current, definitions or regulations don't really honor the past. And I love that we're diving deeper into it and simultaneously looking to the future, but also looking to our past and finding more variety, finding more things that can, bring more flavor, bring more variance, variety.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Yeah,
we're drinking.
We're all looking for new flavors and better flavors, and if the regulations are stifling that, then they're not really fit for purpose.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that was something we were, trying to be careful with the commission was, okay, let's set some things in place, but let's not bind people's creativity and make sure that we can still all have experimentation as we go forward. That's
good to hear. In terms of yourself, what do you like to drink? What sort of whiskies are you into?
I get this question all the time. Miles, what's your favorite whiskey? I say agave.
Mezcal or tequila?
Oh, mezcal, absolutely. Yeah. Been to Oaxaca a few times. No, look, I mean, drinking agave is just, like I said, I've been making whiskey for 11 years now almost, and I love whiskey. And but when I'm off work, I'm taking a break. I'm giving my palate something new to kind of enjoy. But to be perfectly honest, Irish whiskey is my favorite whiskey.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, it's great to be in Dublin and visit the Celtic Whiskey Shop, and I'm always snagging 2 or 3 bottles of something I can't find in the States and bringing it back here and just loving it. And look, I'm super excited for this whiskey renaissance that's been going on in Ireland as well, to see more experimentation and new producers bringing some really amazing stuff out to the game. Irish whiskey is huge for me.
Yeah, I don't want to blow our own trumpet. I'm not Irish, but I feel Irish now. So it's an incredible place to be and to see what's going on, and some really creative distilleries coming up with amazing things. And we're only just seeing the start of it, so it's pretty amazing.
It really is. I think it was last year's Whiskey Live. My stand was next to Mickle, and I brought some of my new make. I proof it down to 45%, but I bring my new make with me often just to have people try it, because I think it's great. We call it barley eau de vie at the distillery. But they saw I had that out, and they pulled out some poutine from under their table, and God, it was delicious. It was absolutely incredible. So man, just loving that.
Yeah, poutine as well. Yeah, that's another thing we could talk about, but I won't keep you for too long. So,
that's all good.
I obviously you can buy the whiskies on our website, and I'll list them at the end of this, and they're definitely worth trying. For me, they taste like a cross between Ireland and Scotland. I'm using that in a very loose term. But I would definitely think your whiskies are going to appeal to the Irish palate. I'm hoping you'd agree with me in that sort of sense.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, look, Westward is a hybrid of styles. It is a single malt, but, we're brewing it like a pale ale. We're distilling it as a single malt. But, we're also aging it as you would a bourbon, because our new make goes into charred new American oak. Right. So you're going to get those coconut, baking spice, vanilla flavors. And for me, as the master blender, I'm always striving for balance. And I know that's kind of a subjective term, but, really, we want this to just be a very approachable, appealing whiskey.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Definitely.
Great. On that note, I think we'll leave it. I would definitely recommend trying the whiskies out, so pick up a bottle. We also have a sister site called dramsdelivered.com where you can buy samples of Westward whiskey as well, which
really
is definitely worth looking at. I'll do a little plug for that at the end. But Miles, thanks for talking to me today, and enjoy Bar Convent Brooklyn. Is that the full name?
That's the one.
Yeah. And we'll see you at another Whiskey Live soon. So cheers. Absolutely. Thanks so much.
How great we could chat. Cheers, man.
Thanks a lot.
You're listening to the Celtic Whiskey Pod, the home of unchill filtered conversation.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Celtic Whiskey Pod, and that maybe it has persuaded you to try some American single malt. You will find the standard Westward single malt along with the stout and Pinot Noir finished editions at CelticWhiskeyShop.com, where they are currently priced at between €76.50 and €92.50. That is subject to change, especially if you're listening long after this episode was released. Our sister website, dramsdelivered.com, also offers 3cl samples of these, where they can be purchased and combined with many other samples of great whiskies. Do go and check out the selection there, as we have some incredible samples of rare and wonderful drams to buy and sample in the comfort of your own home. All that remains to be said is thank you very much to Miles and Westward Whiskey for a great conversation. Thank you to you for listening. Sláinte and goodbye for now.